The first thing to mention, just to go through some of the housekeeping issues related to CLE credits. As you can see from the introductory slides, this program is CLE certified for California and Illinois, 1 hour, and for Missouri, 1.2 hours. During our webinar, we will read 3 code words, and they will appear on the screen as well. And when they do appear, you should write them down, and you will need to provide them in the verification form that is included with the login instructions that you all received. If you do have any CLE questions, please direct them to cle-tc@thompsoncoburn.com. I also need to remind you that you have to log in with the same email address that you used to register for the webinar. This is proof. This login is proof of your attendance and supports your receiving CLE credit. If you need to leave the webinar, please log out and then log back in once you return. The webinar will be 1 hour long. You also will receive an electronic survey form, and we'd be grateful if you could fill that form out and return it to us so we can continually improve our content. So let me address quickly what we will try to cover today. We're going to try to wrap our heads around the challenges of data security up and down the supply chain. And we will first try to lay out the typical ways in which the issues present themselves between vendors and customers. We're going to address the risks that come up and vulnerabilities when one link of the supply chain is penetrated and how that affects other links in the chain. We're then going to spend a fair amount of time talking about a range of protections, both contractual and technological and otherwise. And I think of this as really a lattice work of protections because all of these are interrelated and interdependent. None of them standing alone is sufficient to provide adequate security. Put all together, they help mitigate risk, but there's still going to be holes inevitably, and no set of protections will ever be impervious to attack. We'll then talk about what to do after a breach, and then we'll, as we go through all of these, we'll do our best to sprinkle in real-life examples to make the subject matter a little less abstract. So, setting the table to put this in context, vendors and customers are in a bit of a pickle because everybody is under demand to find lower costs, to outsource to lower cost providers, or to and to use technology to reduce costs and increase efficiency, and also to exploit the value of data, all using technology. But the use of technology, especially the longer the supply chain, the more there is that can go wrong. The greater the risk of loss of control over data, the greater the challenges are of maintaining control up and down the chain. In addition, the more valuable the information, the greater the interest will be among bad actors. Particularly valuable or sensitive information obviously will attract interest from bad actors, and then they will look for the weakest link in the chain to try to penetrate. In addition, challenges arise from uncertain investment and attention by vendors in security. And there's also an element of geopolitical risk. And we'll try to at least cover all of those topics briefly as we go through the slides. One of the challenges in particular is that we are all customers and we are all vendors in one sense or another. Every client I have, and I work mostly on the customer side of the table, but I do represent a number of vendors as well. Everybody is a recipient of data in this chain, and everybody who has the data is doing something with it and therefore has a security concern, and part of what everybody does with it is passes it on to somebody else in one form or another, and in that sense we are all customers. And so we often find that everybody in this situation gets caught between the proverbial rock and hard place, and creates some very interesting challenges, and we're going to try to present some ideas to work through those challenges. And now we come to our first secret word. Number one is encryption. So please write down the word encryption, and you'll have that available later on when you need to verify attendance. The typical vulnerabilities in the supply chain cover a number of areas and a number of weaknesses. The first is what I would characterize as physical disruption that involves tampering with systems, with equipment, outright theft, the insertion of ransomware in the system. The threat can come both from insiders and outside attackers. We have situations where an insider within the company was compromised in sort of a spy thriller type thing, where they were simply bribed to provide access to the company's servers and allow others to hack into the data. And then there's the typical outside attacker who is not associated with the company. We see most often, actually, weaknesses in procedure and human error rather than technical error. Many of the problems arise from carelessness, negligence, intentional acts, as I just mentioned, but in general, people simply not knowing about proper procedure or not following proper procedure. Another area of vulnerability includes contractual weaknesses. That provisions in contracts, for example, that were negotiated years ago with the anticipation of a long-term relationship, but in any case, the contract provisions haven't caught up with the requirements of the current real-world threats. And there is the threat of malware, which will modify source code as it's inserted and be deposited within the host organization, that is to say that the organization that hosts the data.
So Matt, if I can, and this is Melissa Ventron, I just want to pipe in real quick. I think you know, it's important for companies to understand and realize that when you're looking at an overall organization, the organization itself could have 1,000 different endpoints that they need to protect. And really, the attacker only needs one vulnerability, and they get in, exploit that vulnerability, and then provide themselves credentials that look like they're an authorized user moving throughout the network. So really, when you're looking at the scope of risk to an organization, it's much harder to protect the organization because there's so many public-facing touch points, if you will, when the attacker is just looking for that one person who clicks on a phishing email or doesn't protect a system, or the one system that doesn't get upgraded or patches not applied. And so it is difficult, and it's important to really take a holistic look at the whole entire supply chain when you're trying to understand what your particular risk is.
Absolutely. So as we're on the topic of assessing the risk, it's an amorphous and large task, and here are a few bullet points on how to break that task down into manageable pieces. First, you have to get your hands around what kinds of information you're talking about, what kinds of information are being dealt with to begin with. You have to give some thought to the particular value of the information to you as the host entity, and what the loss of that information would cause, what disruption that would cause to your business and your revenue stream. Another element would be the sensitivity of that information to the owner of the information. And, for example, another element might be the regulatory requirements that surround that information. So some information, for example, might be covered by HIPAA, information related to children, educational records, credit card information. All of that is subject to a specific regulatory scheme, and those external regulatory elements should also be considered. Secondly,
and Matt, can I pipe in real quick too? So in addition to identifying when you're assessing the risks, the type of information, you know, we used to talk about data breach just from the concept of data, and there's still a lot of people who really focus on that element, but we also have to look at the system issue as well. So if you have a system that has your marketing information on it and something happens to the marketing information, you know, for most companies, you'll be able to recover. That's really not going to have an impact. But if you're looking at your customer-facing portal, and the particular customer-facing portal goes down, it's not really a data incident, it's more a security system incident, but that still has a financial impact on the organization. So increasing your risk from just a data analysis to also the system analysis is important as well. And I think, you know, that from the data to the system, and then Matt, I think you were going to go into mapping where the information is next.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a holistic approach to this, and part of this also has to include where exactly the information is going, and that includes both where geographically, where the servers are located, if they're within the United States, if they are in Canada, for example, if they're in Europe, if they're in some other jurisdiction. I'm just dealing with a client right now who's using a call center in Canada, and its clients, my client's clients, are very concerned about data moving outside the United States. Well, we're not as concerned about data in Canada as we might be in some other jurisdiction that has laws and legal system that's less different and less risky from ours. So we're going to be able to have a conversation with our clients to educate them about where the data is going. So physical location is important, but also where it's going in terms of which vendors it's going to. And we'll get to the element of diligence on vendors in a second, but it's important to recognize that some vendors have a more robust security system than others and have more capital available to devote to data security. As I mentioned.
Well, and Matt, too, I think with respect to some of the recent news media articles about Facebook, in addition to location, its use as well. So making sure that your vendors are only using the information provided to them for the specific purpose for which it was provided. I think we're all seeing it play out on the public national stage right now, the problems that happen when they don't actually do what they say they're going to do.
Exactly, and that relates to a review of the contractual provisions in terms of what the permitted uses are between the host and the vendor. And as I mentioned, there is an element of geopolitical risk. I remember when the Sochi Olympics were going on, it was pretty much a given that the minute someone walked off the airplane, their mobile device was instantly hacked, and it was just an assumption that that would be the case. As compared to, for example, a jurisdiction like Canada, where we can be, in general, by reputation, a little more confident that the laws and practices and legal enforcement, regulatory enforcement are more similar to what we have in the United States, and can provide us with a greater degree of comfort.
You know, I think, too, Matt, it's really important that companies, we used to talk about geopolitical risk in kind of this very broad perspective, but it's really becoming more important for companies to understand the geopolitical risk when they're operating in other environments. There are some countries that are well known, that have hackers, if you will, or criminal elements that are creating and conducting a number of different attacks. and the government knows that this is occurring and, in fact, taps into some of those resources if they need something to occur or need some cybersecurity assistance on going after whomever they think needs an attack. So it's much more important now to actually sit down and take a real look at what that geopolitical risk is from a company perspective and understand how it's going to impact you as you continue to move forward and operate. China, for instance, their data privacy law or data protection law actually allows the government to have access to any network, and they have defined, and the discussion in the industry is that the definition of network is very broad and can include companies that have internal networks set up for the purpose of just operating that particular company, not sold to third parties or as an internet service provider. So again, it's important to understand the particular geopolitical risk, but of the culture and how it impacts the organization.
Absolutely, and it's important to ask questions, for example, what functions are going to be performed by the vendor? What is the technical infrastructure look like where the vendor is located? What kind of information will be disclosed and flow to the vendor? And what kinds of transparency, both from a contractual perspective and from a legal perspective, are available to the customer in that context. Melissa, I think this is your area.
Mitigating risk. Yes, threat intelligence, that is important. Especially when companies are within certain industries, you want to understand whether or not you have a higher risk, whether you're under a risk for more of the criminal element, whether it's more of we call them hacktivists. We've moved away from the really large person in their mother's basement hacking into people, although it still does occur. It's much more formalized. I think many people are known or do know about Anonymous. So the group out there, Anonymous, that does a lot of hacktivism, if you will. So there's also a particular group that will hack in and post Iranian pictures and propaganda on websites if they can get access to them. So understanding really what the threat vectors are, what the new risks are. For instance, recently, or as soon as it was rolled out, Office 365, a lot of companies have implemented this particular tool. It's a great tool. It provides a lot of flexibility and access from all different types of places and remote access. The problem is with Office 365, you have the email component, and the email component for Office 365, since it's cloud hosted, allows access with just username and password. The number of compromises of email accounts has more than quadrupled since Office 365 rolled out, because the system itself doesn't recognize when somebody is logging in from, say, Nigeria, that they shouldn't be if they're using the individual's actual credentials, their username and password. So if you take nothing else away from this, if you have Office 365, you should probably go back and look at implementing the dual-factor and multi-factor authentication, because that adds an additional layer of security. But it's understanding, as new tools come out, really what's the threat to the organization, who are the individuals that are targeting your particular organization, what are they targeting you for, and how can you educate people on this. And part of the education piece, too, is this concept of tabletop exercises. And I think sometimes organizations are a little hesitant to conduct tabletop exercises because they feel that it would take a lot of time. They can't get everyone together. Tabletop exercises can be as broad or as limited as you really want. And it doesn't have to be an all-day evolution. You can get everyone together for 2 hours and walk through a bunch of different scenarios of actual threats that might be executed against your company, and talk about people's roles, their responsibilities, whether there's any holes in your incident response plans, who's going to do what, who's going to report to what triggers reporting to a board, what's your materiality threshold if you're a public company. But it's important to understand these things before you begin, because once you're in the middle of a fire, you don't really have time to sit down and think through everything. You have to really have almost an intuitive grasp of what your response process is. And then, the mitigating risk side, the vendor diligence. It is so incredibly important for companies to really sit down and take a hard look at their vendors, how their vendors cooperate with you, what kind of information they're going to provide, what they say their security maturity level is. We were working with a company who was looking at using a particular cloud hosting provider, and we asked them if they could provide us with their security policies, and everything they sent over was in draft. And so, that took 10 minutes for the company to take a look at these and say, nope, not gonna go with that particular institution. So understanding that, understanding the important questions, making sure that they are going to be a good business partner, because when you look at various vendors, they have a lot of control over your organization. If you're outsourcing your IT technology functions, if that vendor shuts down, are you shut down? What's your backup plan? If they have your data and you have a dispute over your invoices, are they going to refuse to allow you access to your data if you don't pay? So basically, holding you for ransom. So not just making sure they have appropriate security measures in place, but that they're also a good business partner and willing to work with you. And understand this isn't a us or them, but it's really a concerted effort to make sure that the business continues to operate and has the resources it needs available.
At secret word number 2, and there it is, password. So please write down secret word number 2, password. And the next layer of dealing with vendor risk is through contract. And this is a vast topic we could spend days on just by itself, but here are a few highlights. The first is to just understand the process and where these terms appear. Typically, they will be in the Master Services Agreement. Lately, we've seen separate data security agreements that are appended to the Master Services Agreement. If you are a customer, it's a good idea to have a playbook that you have thought through ahead of time, similar to the tabletop exercise, so you don't have to be reinventing the wheel and you can operate from a set of consistent policies. So you want to have a playbook reflecting your own company's judgments about risk assessment, about acceptable contract provisions, about third rail issues where the great care has to be exercised. And the playbook has to evolve based on changes in external threats, based on changes in technology, customer requirements, and so forth. And going back to the point of we're all customers and we're all vendors, that playbook is going to be an important way for your company as a customer of a service provider. When your company is acting as a vendor to some other company, that playbook is going to be an important element of the diligence that you would be expected to provide from your own customers. So apropos of Melissa's point about not sending documents over in draft, having some of this pre-baked is critically important, and it's a value add for the business itself. Control on the use of subcontractors is important. You want to make sure you have a clear understanding of who you're letting into the tent of data. You want to understand where the data is moving. Build in requirements for these various elements of protection, and we're going to talk about all of these. And have a sense of what's going to happen when there's a breach, how the breach will be handled, what kind of cooperation will be expected, and how things will work on termination of the relationship, both the sense of what kind of breach will be enough to result in a termination for cause or whatever the language is in the contract, and as Melissa said, who owns that data, how do we get that data back once there is a termination. So
well,
yeah, go ahead.
Matt, and I just want to, throw in a war story about how important it is for organizations really to understand and control the use of subcontractors. So, have a client who outsourced most of their IT technology functions and were relying on a third-party company who was using basically a data center to provide these types of services, co-location center, so they had, the servers and stuff set up there, and apparently the third-party IT company was not paying their bills, and so the data center seized the servers and all of the technology that was hosted there for non-payment of invoices. And because the company that had contracted with the IT technology service didn't have any kind of a contract or relationship with that data center, they couldn't get them turned back on. They wouldn't provide the information to them. They wouldn't turn back on the data or hand it over to the company. And so it substantially hindered their ability to do business. So it's so incredibly important to understand who those subcontractors are and what kind of impact they can have on your organization.
And I'll mention another war story point. Dealing with a client that was a customer, we asked for the vendor's provisions on data security, and what they gave us was a bunch of printed off PDFs from their website talking about their aspirations about data security. We intend to do this, we should do this, we strive to do that, we strive to maintain the highest standards of data security. Well, that's all well and good as a PR piece, but all of those shoulds and intends need to be converted into wills and musts, contractual obligations. And it's interesting to see how quickly vendors will beat a hasty retreat once you ask them to actually back up all of the glossy PR materials that they put on the website or that they put in the RFP response. Finally, I would say that a contract is critical, but it is just a contract. Contracts can always be breached, and that's why it's so important to have some of the other elements in the entire portfolio of protections. But let's move on and cover some of these specific protections in a little more detail. Physical and administrative safeguards should be built into the contract as contractual requirements. They should also be built into the contract as part of the service level performance requirements that the vendor has to provide, and should be subject to verification by audit and certification. So starting with destruction of data, there are technical requirements usually on how equipment has to be handled for destruction. Often you'll see that, for example, hard drives have to be pulverized, documents need to be shredded, other media have to have full overwrites or other sort of magnetic destruction. Some thought has to be given to how archived copies and archived information is handled. Physical security, I think of that usually as a broader element of the buildings, the facilities that the vendor uses. These need to be secure. Access to the information needs to be limited to authorized personnel. There should be procedures for badging in, security guards, locked doors, restricted areas, video surveillance, those sorts of things. There needs to be some thought given to security of devices. Can't have people working in Starbucks with screens available to everybody and open networks. We can't have laptops left in taxi cabs or cars. People have to have, vendors have to have restrictions on the use of portable devices and memory devices like thumb drives. The data management piece needs to be subject to an overarching policy that only the people who need to have access to particular information are the ones that actually get that access. So that requires access credentials and logon credentials.
And let me just add in real quick there. So when you're looking at risk, access is one of the biggest risks to an organization, because if somebody has more access than they need, then if a hacker compromises that particular user's credentials, they can gain access to whatever they have access to. So within, especially larger organizations, people move positions. And a lot of times when they move a position, they may not need access to everything they had at the former position, but yet there's no audit of the access right. There's no audit of the credentials. I can't tell you how many times we've handled incidents where somebody said that, oh, this person had left, but they were friendly to the company, and then they got back in and they took extra information. We were going to terminate their credentials in 2 weeks after they left. It all sounds like very simple things, and I'm sure, there's companies out there that would say, oh, it would never happen to us, but it's important to remind the people who are actually terminating the access why they should do so and how important it is. There are passwords and credentials across the organization, not just from logging onto the computer, accessing the email, accessing any of the financial accounts, but accessing the servers, accessing the domain controller, which allows you to navigate through the network, accessing the remote desktop protocol. Even on small organizations, there's probably 100 different access points and credentials out there. If they all use the same one, then the attacker only needs to compromise one and they have access to everything. IT, for instance, a lot of times you will find that in mid-sized and smaller organizations, IT uses the same credentials for admin changes as they do for their user account. And that means that if their credentials get compromised, and it has happened, IT does get compromised just like other departments, they have access to everything that the IT person has, because they simply didn't separate the user from the responsibility as admin. So not only is this one of the most important policies to have in place, the audit function or the review function of this particular policy is incredibly important as well.
Yeah, that's really, that point can't be overstressed. It's a fundamental principle of data security, that you have to limit the people who have access to information, and you have to limit the scope of information that's available to those people to information that's only necessary for their job. I will not tell the war story of how my son, as a teenager, hacked into my Facebook account because someone didn't use multiple passwords. I'm not going to name any names. The employee training goes hand in hand with that. So it's both a top-down policy from the company, and it's a bottom-up set of behaviors from employees. And training should be mandated by contract between the vendor and the customer. Training should cover things like helping employees be aware of what confidential information is, what are the confidentiality requirements in the particular MSA. They should be educated about how to recognize and report security incidents, how to deal with passwords to not do what I did, how to recognize phishing and other suspicious emails, awareness of how to deal with portable devices and making sure that as you go through the airport security line, you pick up the right laptop. And there should also be an awareness of employee sanctions for failure to comply with those basic fundamental behavioral requirements.
Hey, Matt, real quick, back to the training. Companies spend a lot of money on technology. They spend a lot of money on monitoring. They spend a lot of money on, intrusion protection, detection tools. They spend money on antivirus. In my opinion, most companies do not spend enough money on training. You can have the best technology out there. You can have the best tools, but all you need is one person to make a mistake somewhere, and it'll bypass all of those protections you have in place. I heard someone once say, if we could control the fleshy things on a keyboard, the fingertips, we would have a lot less security incidents. That's true. The human factor gets into everything from, you know, missing one device when they're updating it, from not doing a thorough enough investigation, from falling for a phishing email, from sharing your credentials because you want to be useful because the CEO asked you for them. I mean, we can't really get around the human factor. And so the employees are the first line of defense to any organization. And it is worthwhile putting some money into training them to make sure that they recognize and understand the risk. And it is, you know, I know it's hard to get employees to want to go to training because they're like, why do I have to listen to another presentation? But it's not just a company function, it's a personal function because it helps protect them and their accounts at home as well. So there's ways to make it more realistic and more real for them, but training is probably one of the most overlooked things from an organizational perspective.
And to add on to that, it is a real value add to the company where these employees work in two respects. One is I've had the CEO asking for just to have someone in the finance department share a password. That happens, and that then pops up on the audit that is performed by the outside accountants. And when you get an internal control notation on the audit, investors take notice of that, lenders take notice of that. That's a problem. And on the more positive side, it's a great opportunity for the vendor to showcase how well they do on this as a business promotion tool to provide support and comfort to the vendor's clients and customers that everything is above board and shipshape, and they can be responsive to all of those diligence requirements that we were talking about a minute ago. And then, of course, every employee in some way or another needs to be subject to a confidentiality agreement and policy or policy that's appropriate to their position within the company. Not everybody needs to have the longest and most detailed agreement, but some people do. But everybody should have some contractual requirement both to maintain confidential information of the company and of third parties that provide information to the company. They should have consent. This agreement and the policy should make it clear that there is consent for the company to audit and view their usage of company IT systems and emails and of company cell phones and equipment. So now we are going to move on to mitigation techniques, and Melissa will walk us through some of these technical issues.
So, you know, as I mentioned before, there's a variety of different technical features that organizations can use, and it's really up to the organization on the ones that work for them. Here's the thing, if you implement technical controls in your organization, but your organization doesn't know how to use them or monitor them, they're practically worthless. You have to have the people and the resources in addition to the technology to make sure that your organization, that you're doing the best that you possibly can to protect it. Firewalls, there's still, you would probably be surprised, there are still companies out there that don't have firewalls, or they have firewalls set up and it has logging, but the logging is minimal. If you have these controls in place and they're capturing some information, but the information they're capturing is only, you know, 24 hours, if you will, then you're not going to be able to go determine what has occurred after there's an incident. You need to be able to see all of the roadblocks, if you will, or the particular steps that people have gone through when they get into your organization. So having the firewalls in place, making sure that they're set up properly and they're maintaining and recording the right information is important. Encryption, there's a lot of talk about encryption. I know that that there were model contractual terms, I think it was, for outside counsel that were pushed out by ACC, and it talked about encrypting it defined all client information as confidential and talked about encrypting all client information, which is really not feasible. There has to be a discussion, if you will, about what is appropriate for encryption and what doesn't work. There's different encryption technologies. There's encryption at rest. There's encryption in transmission, and it has to work for the organization. But if you're not putting encryption, then you have to document why it's not working and what your additional mitigatory tools are that you're putting in place to take care of the fact that, you know, encryption doesn't work for this particular item. Virus and malware. Virus scanning and malware, it's important to have that pretty much on all systems. It does not catch everything. Regardless of what particular program you use, it is not going to catch everything. I think even the ones that are highest rated a lot of times catch 60 to 70%. So you want to have defense in depth as you go through these technologies. The security monitoring, intrusion, detection prevention systems, those are incredibly important, but if you don't tell them what to look for, they're not going to work. So we see a lot of malicious activity from Nigeria. And you can set up your security monitoring and intrusion detection prevention systems to flag activity that originates in Nigeria, or there's a lot of activity from Russia if the organization doesn't operate there. So you can tell the systems how you want it to operate, you just need to know what it's looking for. And if you're outsourcing these, you have to make sure that the vendor that you're outsourcing it to understands what you're asking them to do. Working with a client who had basically blocked connections to their customer-facing portal from various countries, they rolled over to a new provider who only blocked those types of activities when they had a DDoS attack. So, and they didn't learn about it until there were suspicious connections to their network from those particular countries. So, you know, making sure that you continue to have the same type of security controls implemented, and if you change systems, going through that process with the vendor to make sure that they are implementing the same controls you had in place previously is important. And then we talked about limited employee access depending on need to know. That's very, very important. It is hard sometimes because if you're in smaller organizations, you know, the CEO might want access to everything. You really have to talk to them about what's important and what controls the risk. Ransomware is a virus that basically trolls along lines of access. So if, say, somebody's credentials are compromised and they get in the system and they drop ransomware under that user's profile, anything that user has access to would then be encrypted. So again, it's not just limit access because you have a contractual obligation or limit access because regulators expect you to. It's also limit access because you want to limit the risk surface, if you will, of your particular system. And then, Matt, I'm going to flip it back over to you for the open source software debate.
Yeah, well, Melissa and I just had a question a few days ago from a client. They're putting out an RFP. They wanted some input on whether open source software presented a greater security risk than custom software. I think at first blush, you might think that because it's open source, everybody's going to have access to it, and therefore it's more vulnerable. The current state of thinking really is that it's no greater of a risk for using open source software for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's a much larger community of people working on patches and fixes and other defensive kinds of measures. Because of this broader community, it might be faster to have the fix put in place. So I think the current state of play on that issue is that there really is no significantly greater risk from open source software. Melissa, maybe you could walk us through vendor testing and monitoring and some of those issues there.
Absolutely. So when you're looking at reporting and cooperation, when you're working with vendors, it sounds kind of, I guess for lack of a better word, stupid, if you will, that you should need to put into a contract that they will cooperate and provide you information about a security incident that impacts your data. However, I think especially in the U.S., a lot of companies are afraid of litigation. They're afraid of sharing information, so they want to keep as much as they possibly can quiet and confidential and only share little drips and drabs of what has occurred. But you, as the customer of the vendor, have the right to know what's occurred with your data, what they've done, what the investigation is, if they got a third party in, how do you know that it's safe now, and that this type of whatever the particular incident isn't going to happen again. So, you know, making sure that they have the obligation to cooperate and respond to any reasonable request that you have for information is important. Some clients go as far as to ask that they be allowed to be involved in the investigation. There's a fair amount, and a lot of that has to do with how much leverage you have from a contracting perspective on whether they will allow that. The vendor testing, monitoring, reporting on their information security systems. Security is a living, breathing animal. It's not something that you can just plug in and forget and do nothing about, because new vulnerabilities come out all the time. Systems have to be patched and updated. There's new threat vectors that occur out there. So people change over at organizations, things change, systems change, hardware changes. So you really want to know that the vendor has taken a look at, tested its systems, that they're constantly monitoring the systems, and they're providing you with whatever assurances you require or need, whether it's a SOC 2 report or an ISO certification or you know, other certifications that are available out there, so that you have that sense of assurance that they're continuing to have an outside third party review their systems if appropriate, or that they're doing the internal review as well. And then the SLAs. So I don't think there's enough attention spent or time spent on SLAs, the service level agreements that basically tell you what your right is, how long the systems are going to be up, what your right is to recover anything. Every single SLA that I've ever looked at does not take into consideration this concept of ransomware. So for instance, if a system gets hit by ransomware, a vendor system, and I've had this happen to clients, and the system goes down, the fastest I have ever seen an organization get back up is 7 days, the fastest. The longest it took one of the organizations to get back up was 13 days, and that was only partially up, because you have to, if ransomware hits and it gets into the operating system, then you can't just restore from backup. You may have to replace, you may have to entirely clean it. It takes time. SLAs don't take this into consideration. They're down for 13 days. They have your medical record system, and you have to continue to use it. It has your scheduling system. It has whatever else you need, and you're only entitled up to 30% of whatever the credit is, and your credit is only continuing to get further services. So basically, your credit is, congratulations, you've just extended your contract with them. So really taking a look at those SLAs, understanding what they are from a practical perspective, talking to IT, information technology about what it would mean is very, very important for organizations. And we talked about, you know, incident response plan, notifying the customer if there's any kind of actual or attempted breach. That's important as well. Again, it comes back to the cooperation. And you need to define whatever it is the timeline is that is important for you as an organization. You'll see in contracts that they request notice immediately. Frankly, when we're working with organizations that have a breach, I've never seen an organization make that immediately timeline, because they don't actually know what has happened. They just know something has happened and they need to investigate it. So I think being reasonable with respect to timeline, you know, 72 hours or something along those lines, or as soon as reasonably possible if it's going to have a broader public impact. But the organization should talk with the vendor about what this looks like and give them their concerns. You know, cooperation with respect to regulatory compliance, that's especially important now with GDPR coming online. For those who fall under the scope of the GDPR, are required by contract to comply, because the supervisory authorities have the right to ask questions and come in and do audits and take a look at, subject to certain limitations, information. Under HIPAA, HHS, OCR, they will come in and ask you for all of your policies. They will also ask you for information about your vendors. So you need to make sure that there's a requirement that they continue to cooperate with the regulatory investigation or regulatory compliance aspect of it. And then assistance with mitigating damages. This has taken on a whole new flavor when you're looking at personal information, because we have the concept of credit monitoring and identity restoration. And I think that's going to continue to evolve as this world or area, as you will, continues to evolve as well. But you know, if part of the damage mitigation is additional information about what the security measures are that are in place to help protect it, if it's a public-facing statement, if it's, you know, the credit monitoring, if it's sending out letters, you want them to agree to work with you on mitigating whatever the potential damages are. So the mitigation aspect is incredibly important, because I don't think there's any organization out there that can say with 100% certainty we will never be breached and this will never happen to us. It's more a concept of when it happens, not if it happens. Matt, anything to add on that?
Well, no, I think that segues perfectly into the next slide that relates to the indemnity provisions in the contract. And typically the master services agreement will have, from the vendor's perspective, will have a cap on the types of damages that are recoverable. In other words, the MSA will exclude consequential damages and other sorts of damages like that. And there will be a cap on the total amount of damages that are recoverable, usually based on the either a multiple or a fraction of the spend under that contract. And for many elements that is appropriate, but for data breaches, that's not appropriate. It just doesn't work to balance the risks, and it's not really fair for the vendor to insist on that, given the risk and liability that may accrue to the customer. So what we like to try to do is fine-tune between functionality, reps and warranties that, for example, the software or the services will conform to the specifications, will be performed in a workmanlike manner. On the one hand, that's where a damages cap is appropriate, and then on the other hand, for data breaches, we would exclude a limitation on consequential damages for precisely the reason that Melissa was just talking about, because of all the remediation expenses, all of the regulatory compliance expenses, and possible fines and things of that nature. And we'll also have either no cap for the breach or a much larger cap on the breach. And because of the sensitivity of data to the reputation of the company, rather than letting the vendor control the defense and settlement of the claim, we will negotiate that the customer itself, for those particular issues, has the opportunity to control the defense and settlement of that claim because of the wide-ranging impact on the customer. And Melissa, I think you have some thoughts on insurance.
So, yeah, so insurance, I think, for network privacy expenses is incredibly important, and it's not as expensive as most people think. It's still a relatively new product. Insurance companies pay out on this because they want people to know that this type of insurance responds. So it's important to make sure your insurance covers the first and third party costs. It needs to cover the forensic investigation. It'll cover crisis communication. It will cover reputational loss. There's business interruption. It'll cover the notification costs, you know, any third-party liability really arising out of this. And then also it can cover, some of them cover social engineering that results from a compromise of the system. They will also cover extortion and ransomware, which are two different things. Extortion is somebody grabs all your stuff and then basically sends you a note saying, hey, I have it, pay me money, or I'm going to do X with this data. Ransomware is a virus that encrypts everything, and you get a pop-up that says, email this account and pay Bitcoin, and we'll give you the decryption key, and they have processes for expediting the approval of that. So, and it also gives you access to vendors, it gives you access to forensics, to legal, to crisis communication, who have been recognized as having more of a skill set in this particular area. So getting that built into the contract is incredibly important, and making sure that if the vendor has an incident, they're able to cover whatever their particular costs are, which will help you mitigate yours.
And building into the contract provisions, for example, of making the customer an additional insured and some other things that provide for coverage beyond the termination of the particular contract. We're now at our third word, which is firewall. Make a note of that, please. And Melissa, I think we've covered a number of these topics already, but it certainly can be valuable, certainly is a must from the customer's perspective, that the vendor do their own security assessment, that they have independent validation of that, and that the customer itself has the right to do some audits.
I would agree, and get the results of the audits that their particular vendor does to make sure that they know that the vendor is continuing to follow the contract and their, applicable policies and procedures.
So we're just coming to the end of our time, but Melissa, I'm wondering if you could maybe give us a thought or two about any one or more of these bullet points. I'm particularly interested in some best practices in working with consultants and doing that in a way that preserves attorney-client privilege.
Sure. So the recommendation when you're dealing with cybersecurity or an incident or a data breach or anything like that is when you're engaging any kind of third party, so going outside the organization, is to do so under the attorney-client privilege, because you want to protect yourself if something occurs down the road and somebody files a lawsuit from having to produce everything because none of it was protected. Systems, review systems, things like that. You're looking at, what are the applicable laws? How do the applicable laws apply? Are you following those particular laws? For instance, Massachusetts requires that certain personal information of Massachusetts residents be encrypted. There's a variety of different things along those lines, but there is case law that supports the concept of attorney-client privilege in really the cybersecurity arena. You have to be careful on how it applies. You don't want to, the less you put in writing, the better. Obviously, I think that's every attorney would say that across the board. But the attorney-client privilege perspective is very, very important. The other thing, too, is working with attorneys who have familiarity in the space are really able to help narrow and focus whatever the work is of that consultant so that the ultimate product that the company is getting fits the needs for whatever the particular scope is. There's this concept of mission creep that occurs occasionally, and we really want to do our best to avoid that.
All right. Well, thank you, Melissa. We're really bumping up against the end of our time frame. Thank you all for your participation in this. And if there are any questions that come up after we leave the webinar, please feel free to give either one of us a call or send us an email. We'll be glad to chat with you. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.